This is Peter Kovacek. In this session, Productivity 2016, What We Know and What We Thought We Knew. This is part 3 in a 3-part series of videos. The first video was part 1, Background Productivity Concepts. The second, part 2, Productivity Then and Now. And now this is part 3, Managing Towards a Productive Team. Now, a more thorough examination of productive behaviors and clinical activities is included in the work that we've done on the productive therapist. And there'll be a reference to that body of work a little bit later on in this video. But I want to mention that there is a second alternative to this. We'll be looking primarily at the management sides of a productive team with some basic concepts just to get you interested in that topic. I want to be very, very clear that we strongly believe that productivity is something that can be improved. And up until now, we've laid the background and the environment for how to make decisions about measuring productivity. And now we're going to talk about how to become more productive, how to manage in such a way that creates an environment where people can be productive. There are several factors in productivity that we know about. The first one is systems and infrastructure. This includes your organizational vision, your management philosophy, the structure of the department or a clinic that you work in, the various tools and resources that are available, and a very excellent video is available at this reference called the Productive Clinic video, which takes a look at many of those systems and structures. Now, it's important to understand that the role of a manager is to create an environment in which staff can succeed. That environment is comprised of a strategy, execution, but also systems and infrastructure. Without the systems and infrastructure, there's no milieu in which people can actually accomplish their work. So that balance between systems, infrastructure, strategy, and execution is what makes up administration, management, and leadership. It's also important to recognize that there are personal behaviors that truly do influence an individual's productivity, one of which is the ability to change, learn, and adapt. We are in an environment in healthcare that is constantly changing. It's been changing in the 40 years that I've been involved in it as a therapist, and it will continue to change. Many experts will point out that it seems to be changing at an ever-increasing rate, and that the rate at which it's changing today is faster than it's ever changed in the past, and that will continue. That's great. The ability of the individual clinician and the manager to change with the changing environment, still maintaining the core values that we have as clinicians, the ability to learn in a lifelong manner, and then to adapt to that learning and that change will truly determine their ability to tolerate change. Now, it is possible, I believe, for individuals to be completely unable to handle any more change because there has been so much change. And in essence, that becomes a situation where, and I compare it to if you were to fill up a water tumbler with water, and you were to continue to fill it after it's already full, it would just spill over the sides and make a mess. To some extent, I think that there is a comparison to individuals and their ability to tolerate change, that at some point they become that full water tumbler. And to continue to require them to tolerate change and to become they become full and they just cannot handle it. So the ability to sense that environment, to be able to work with staff to determine where they are in their tolerance to change can be a very, very important factor. There are also clinical skills that really do matter. The manner in which we handle our clinical decision making, the manner in which we communicate with our patients, our efficiency in moving from patient to patient, from moving from activity to activity. Many of these skills include the need to be incredibly strong from a verbal standpoint, to be able to communicate with people from very many backgrounds with very different educational levels, sometimes with different original language skills, and this can become quite a challenge. There is also a strong need to recognize that the actual clinical decisions that individuals make have a huge impact on their productivity. And that oftentimes failure in productivity is a failure of strategy because we've chosen to pursue a certain clinical pathway that was the wrong strategy based on a bad diagnosis or preconceived bias that we may have clinically. So all of those failures are possible when we talk about clinical skills. There also has to be, as a factor in productivity, the motivation to succeed, and that success has to be defined by the individuals and the team collectively. Oftentimes, a guarantee of failure is when the management or the organization defines success in one way, and that the individuals, the staff, define it in another way. In that situation, I liken that to someone who's in a rowboat with a partner, and one is rowing one direction, one's rowing the other. At best, you go in circles, and at worst, you get nowhere or go backwards. So the motivation to succeed has to be there. It has to be consistent, and it has to be a concept that's defined and agreed upon by both the leaders and the clinical staff. Defining success requires consensus, and also requires a bit of time understanding what does success look like and what does it feel like, and recognizing when it occurs. And this can occur from various perspectives, and I will go back to the various silos we talked about in the past. We may have two silos that we really didn't talk about in part one, but could be the staff silo and the management silo, or the department and the organization, and they could have varying perspectives, and they could have differing definitions of success. Certainly it is possible for there to be different definitions of success from a patient versus a clinician, and vice versa. In order to talk about success, I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking about a performance management model. Now, in the first part of this video series, we talked about failure, and failure has two real components to it. One is a failure that's caused by poor strategy, or wrong strategy, and also there's a failure of execution, which is by a poor performance. And obviously you could do both at the same time, which would be a real mess. One of the best performance management models that I've ever seen is one that has been put forth by Clay Carr back in the early 80s. And what Carr says is that to be successful in any situation, every worker must know what to accomplish. They must know how to accomplish it. They must have access to the tools to accomplish it. They need to be motivated to succeed in an agreed upon definition of success. They need to take responsibility for their own success, and they need to recognize success when it occurs. Carr goes on to say that failure in any one or more of these 6 aspects decreases the likelihood of a positive worker outcome. Now, I will very, very strongly suggest to you that not only does this apply in a workplace environment, this applies in a clinical environment, it applies in a family environment, it applies in volunteer situations, in almost every scenario, that in order for the performance of a task to be successful, the better you can deal with these 6 aspects, the better the outcome is likely to be. It does not guarantee success, and having none of these 6 in play, does not guarantee failure. But the chances of success are much higher when these 6 are well identified and well dealt with. Additionally, I use these 6 daily with the people that I work with to go back and look at performance that's been less than fully successful, and find out, using this as a diagnostic tool, where did we run into problems? Was it that they didn't know what was to be accomplished? Did they not know how to accomplish it or have the skill to accomplish it? Were they lacking access to the tools? Was there a reason for them to not be motivated to succeed in as much the way that I would have anticipated them being successful? Were they not willing to take responsibility for their own success? And when it happened, did they know it? Were they able to tell? I think that this is a very, very powerful model. As simple as it is, it's still extremely powerful, both as a planning and a diagnostic tool. And I would strongly encourage you to take a look at Clay Carr in more detail, including some of the resources that are available at the PT Manager website, ptmanager.com, where you can download worksheets to use the Clay Carr model. But I think it's a very, very powerful model. Now, as a quick aside here, performance management is a critical part of any manager's job, and it really involves the execution. This is the core of management. and execution means putting good management to work. I want to just spend a little bit of time here talking about a program that is currently available and will become even more available very, very soon through the American Physical Therapy Association Health Policy Administration section, the Catalyst, their LAMP program. And LAMP stands for Leadership, Administration, Management, and Professionalism. There is a LAMP, a very, very strong and well-respected and very successful LAMP leadership program that's been going on for years. But the inaugural event of the LAMP Administration and Management program will happen in February in San Antonio, February 2017, in San Antonio as a two-day pre-conference, the core of which is going to be CAR's performance management model. Additionally, it will look at other factors of management and administration, including finance and planning and strategy and communication skills and human resource and legal aspects. But this is the first comprehensive attempt by anyone within the American Physical Therapy Association that I know of to really take a look at these issues on an ongoing basis. And it will be a 101 level course for people who are aspiring to be managers, people who are new managers, or even for experienced managers, but especially for people who teach managers, including university faculty. So I can't put in a strong enough plug for that. You can get information on that from the section on health policy and administration of the American Physical Therapy Association. Now, as we move forward here, let's talk about assessing personal behavior as it relates to productivity. And one of the questions that has to be asked, are there preferred behaviors to become more productive? And the answer is absolutely yes. And that's the essence of the productive therapist model that we produced on ptmanager.com. So are these preferred behaviors known, and are they knowable to the individuals who are to use them? If not, a very easy way to do that is to review the 1-hour video on the productive therapist. Secondly, what are the skill levels in these preferred behaviors? Skill acquisition, as we all know as clinicians, is not a linear process, that sometimes skill and success will drop as people learn new skills until they become proficient in those skills. So there may be a time that we need to allot for people to practice, to develop these skills, to become a more expert at them, and sometimes do some honest reflection that, that may not be an area that they're particularly strong at. The third question here is, how sacrosanct are the old behaviors? One of the things that I see on a regular basis is that many people in their clinical practice have certain sacred cows that they don't even know why they're sacred. A very frequent thing is when I ask people about certain behaviors that they engage in clinically, well, why do you do it that way? And I'll see folks with 20, 25, 30, 35 years of experience explain to me that the reason that they do it that way is because that's how they were taught in school 20, 25, 30, 35 years ago. If that's the only rationale that they have, I think that should be challenged. I think that there should be some reflection on, is that the best way? And it may be. But I do it this way because I do it this way is probably not an adequate foundation for trying to learn new skills. One of the things that I always suggest is that people go through an analysis of the different personal productivity behaviors that we see in the productive therapist, and then do a gap analysis. And there's a lovely self-assessment of productivity behaviors that allows them to go through all of the skills and all the behaviors that we talk about in the productive therapist, and allow them to say, here's where I am at this point. This is my assessment of my skill level in this area. Here's where I'd like to be. And then when they compare those two, if there is a difference, if there's a gap, they may want to put together a plan to try to bridge that gap and to improve towards where they wish to be, to their level of preferred performance. So here are some of the here are some of the higher productive behaviors that we know of as they relate to the old guard of clinical revenue as a measure of productivity. In a situation where that's not true, some of these may not be the appropriate behaviors, and it's a fascinating area of continuing study for us. But at least in the time being, most of us have some footing in the older fee-for-service clinical revenue surrogates for productivity. The first one is that people who have higher productivity behaviors tend to have what we call a project management mindset. They look at critical pathways for the completion of tasks. They look at tasks as if they were projects. They look at what activities are prerequisites for others, what's the timing, and there's a certain logic and planning component that goes into it. Studying the project management literature is probably time well spent for most clinicians, and it's time that and it's a topic that we typically don't get to any degree at all in our professional education. The second behavior is that many of the higher productive therapists actually study productivity and try to learn about it as if it was a discipline, like learning French or learning physics or those sorts of disciplines that we think of from a school standpoint. Productivity can be learned and it needs to be studied. There are certain things that work better for some people and work better for others. But one of the things that we know is that we struggle because there's not a strong shared vocabulary amongst physical therapists and physical therapist assistants to discuss issues of productivity. One of the goals of the productive therapist study was to try to establish a vocabulary that people could talk about these things without tripping over the lack of vocabulary that existed. We also know that people who study productivity as a discipline tend to develop extremely efficient and strong verbal patterns when they talk with their clients that are appropriate for the clients with which they're speaking. This verbal pattern tends to be much more succinct with fewer actual words and focus more on the patient able to feed back to us what we're asking or discussing. But verbal pattern excellence is an area that people can really study. One of the things that we find in higher productive therapists related to their verbal patterns is that they do tend to use fewer words and that those words tend to have fewer syllables. So they speak more simply and more succinctly. We also find that when you study productivity as a discipline, you're willing to enter into a culture of experimentation and discovery to see what works for you, as opposed to, I've done it this way for 30 years and I plan to continue doing it this way. That also includes the sharing of tips and tricks and traps that people find, the sharing of these found gems that may work in one clinic but not another, but people at least can say, here's some things that I found that work for me in this situation. And that again falls back into that studying productivity as if it was a discipline. Very close related to all three of the videos in this series is that there's the need to have an understanding of the environmental demands. What are the incentives that each of the different kinds of clinical revenue environments really do require, and how is that changing in our setting? It may be different, for example, if someone were to work in, let's say, a couple of different settings, a skilled nursing facility versus home care, versus outpatient care versus acute care or ICU, that each of these environments has specific demands and certain things that you're incentivized to do. And that may not be as simple and as clean as it should be given the different settings that we work in, but that is what the environment is. Right now it's a little bit messy. We also need to understand that there need to be standards for improvement as the environment changes. I'm not a big fan of benchmark standards of, if you work in outpatient, you usually see this number of patients a day, those sorts of things, because I think that every environment's a little bit different. But I do think that whatever the current performance is, that the direction of change should be towards higher productivity, and that can be accomplished often just by the elimination of lower productive behaviors. One of the areas that we've just recently begun to study over the last 4 or 5 years is that of transitions. And I think that one of the things that fascinates me about transitions is that they may be one of the most important areas in all of the productivity literature that I've seen, and certainly in a clinical setting as we've observed clinicians at all levels and all settings. Transitions are the ability of a clinician, for example, to engage a patient, get them going, and then move on to the next activity. It includes the transition of the start of care. It includes the transitions of shifting from one activity to the next during care. And very, very importantly, it's the transitions that are involved in terminating that visit and getting the patient out the door, and so that you can move on to other things. Transitions also include things like interruptions. So, for example, while doing documentation, phones ring, people walk in, and the ability to efficiently deal with those sorts of situations that demand clean and efficient transitions really makes a huge difference. And maybe one of the most powerful of all of the productivity behaviors that we've ever seen. Higher productivity behaviors also include accountability. That therapists and other clinicians know what's expected of them, how are they doing compared to that expectation, and if there is a gap, what can I do to improve it? Going back to the clay car model, going through all 6 of those concepts and making sure that they do know what to do and how to do it and have the skill to do it and have access to the tools, that they're motivated to succeed. I would suggest to you that it is frequently the case that therapists are not motivated to be more productive, for many, many reasons. There also are certain high productive management practices, such as how meetings are run, or meetings that the number of meetings and the length of meetings and the frequency of meetings, how other things are communicated, and how does that occur. If everything has to shut down so that we can have a 5-minute meeting, great, but maybe that's not the best way to do things if it's just going to be a meeting where there's knowledge that's handed down. Tell kinds of communications are often best done in writing and don't require face-to-face, whereas team building and problem solving and brainstorming really does require face-to-face for the most part. And certainly there are alternative mechanisms of communication that are becoming more and more available digitally and otherwise. But it's especially a problem, meetings and communications, for folks that are in disparate geographic locations, whether those are within a single building like a large hospital, or in different clinics spread out throughout a geographic area or metropolitan area. Lastly, in this area, the last thing I want to mention is one of the most important higher productive management practices. How do we as an organization retain organizational knowledge and document that knowledge, that history, that culture, so that we're not consistently redoing the things we've done before. One of the things we've done in many of our practices is for information that just has to be shared, instead of having it done live in person every single time it needs to be done. So, for example, things that have to be repeated at once a year, we do a video. And then, rather than everybody getting together for a concurrent meeting, they can do review of the information by watching the video, which is a knowledge-based concept, at their convenience on their schedule. Also, it does then create an archive for what was actually done in case that's ever necessary. To develop a personal clinical productivity action plan, I would suggest that first you do an organizational gap analysis of your current systems and structures. The systems and structures are the environment at which people work. If those are inefficient, productivity will be challenged. Secondly, once you've done that and have begun to develop a plan and implement a plan to fix some of your systems and structures, it's necessary to do a gap analysis on the clinical productivity behaviors of each of the individual clinicians. They then should take 2 to 3 actions based on that gap analysis that they need to improve upon. There may be many, and as a manager, you should facilitate them as much as possible in working towards a couple of actions at a time to try to get more efficient and higher levels of productivity. The productive therapist self-assessment, called the Productivity Quiz, is a great way to start for those steps 2 and 3 there. You want to have the discussion with the staff of what systems are interfering with them, whether that's documentation or scheduling or transporting, whether it's human resources, whether it's It could be linen systems. And then what systems are interfering with them being as efficient as possible? Who will help them as they look at their own clinical productivity behaviors that need to improve? And also the system that the management and the organization as a whole are looking at improving. What other resources are needed to improve? What's the time frame for improvement? How will we know if improvement happened? Are there metrics? Once those are identified, how will we know it? How will we recognize it? What's the timeliness of those? What's the cost of getting those metrics analyzed? And then publishing the gained knowledge and skills to the rest of the staff, sharing what's there, what they've learned, and then repeat. This is an ongoing process that probably doesn't really have an endpoint, but rather just cycles back to from number 9 back to number 1. There are some resources that we want to talk about here related to giving you some direction on managing and leading productive staff. As we did when we started the first part of this video series, we did something called expectation planning, where we said, in order for this to be successful for you, in order for this to be worthwhile for you, what has to happen? I think that that's a very important process to be used with staff at every level. So that question might be, in order for you to become more productive and for that to be worthwhile, what are the things that have to happen in that process? And they might say, well, I want to make sure that I feel respected as a clinician. I want to make sure that I'm still making decisions about my patients, that I'm still being heard and listened to. Expectation planning is very personal, and it is something that has to be reviewed on a regular basis. So if you have done expectation planning with staff when it comes to productivity monitoring, at multiple points throughout the process, you might want to go back and say, take a look at those things that you put down in expectation planning. How are we doing towards those? In just a couple of slides, we're going to be doing that for this video series, and it's I think, a very, very powerful tool for you to use. There are some homework things that you might want to take a look at from ptmanager.com. The Productive Therapist video is about an hour long, and it looks at the clinical behaviors of individual clinicians that were high productive or low productive. It does it in a very non-threatening way, and it's a great resource for you, and you can get it at ptmanager.com. As part of that, there is a self-assessment on productivity behaviors called the Productivity Quiz. There's also a fantastic case study, which is called the Harriet Hands-On case study, about a therapist who is very, very strong clinician, very beloved amongst the staff, great long-term employee who's now struggling with productivity, and takes you through some of the steps of how do you deal with that and how do you help Harriet continue to be successful. And the case study is one that you can do yourself. You can do it with staff. You can do it with students. It works very, very well. We've used it for many, many years, and it really is a good case study. There's also a performance management video that you can take a look at that goes over into much more detail than I've gone into, the Clay Car model. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the Productive Clinic video that you can get at ptmanager.com. Readings that I would suggest would be on motivation, time management, supervision, communication, and change management, and the literature is very rich on all of those. In order to establish a common vocabulary to discuss these sorts of things, here are the references to the Productive Therapist video, the Productive Clinic video, the case study of Harriet Hands-On, the Performance Management video, and then again a reference to the APTA section on Health Policy Administration, LAMP Administration and Management, at Combined Sections meeting in San Antonio, Texas in February of 2016 as a 2-day pre-conference. I would strongly encourage you to participate in that. At this point, we're done with part 3, although we've just started to scratch the surface on this. In part 1, we looked at the background productivity concepts. In part 2, we looked at productivity then and now and how the environment's changing. And in part 3, we started to look at some of the concepts of managing a productive team. We've tried to make this as quick and as efficient as possible by giving you lots of references that you can do a deeper dive if you need to, but I hope you found it helpful. Now, I want you to go back and look at the slide and your comments related to expectation planning. And in the expectation planning, we have you complete this sentence. In order for this session to be worthwhile or successful for me, I expect the following to happen. You wrote some things down. How did we do? If for some reason we didn't meet all those expectations, please feel free to let me know that. You can get my email and even my phone number at ptmanager.com. And I'd be happy to help you and hear what you have to say about that, or if you have any suggestions. You may want to go back and review some of the videos as they cover material rather quickly. But if your expectations weren't met, let's go back and problem solve. Why weren't they met? What were the things that needed to be done? Do we need to make some changes? Do you need to have some additional background information? If so, I can provide additional resources for you. Every clinician I've ever met that I respect, and every manager that I've ever met that I respect, wanted to be able to say this, and I wanted to be able to say this about them. I want you to be proud of what you do each and every day with each and every patient. I want you to be the best clinician you can be. I want you to be the best manager you can be. The purpose of this video series is to help you do that. I hope you have found it helpful. Thanks for watching. I appreciate any feedback that you have. There's a bunch of references here that you can take a look at. I wish you all the best.